Welcome to the Shield Your Business from Chaos podcast, where there's no building, no people, no third-party suppliers, and no systems all combined to create Chaos the Dragon, which is battled by King Phoenix and his shield.
Hi, welcome to the Kingsbridge BCP podcast, where we talk about all things business continuity. My name is Roswitha Firth, and with me today is Alicia Henderson. Before we get started, I'd like to say just a few words about our sponsor, Kingsbridge. Kingsbridge has been in the business continuity software field and consulting field for multiple decades, since 1983. We've got, I think, 100 plus years of experience under their belt looking at the team members, and they provide business continuity software and consulting services to a variety of industries, companies, large and small. I enjoy doing this podcast. I thank you for joining us. If this is your first time, please check us out wherever you find your podcasts. We've done over 20 some odd episodes. We've just completed our first year, and I'm grateful to be able to do this going into a second year. Alicia, thank you for joining us. Just a little bit we want to say before we get started. Alicia has been in the business continuity field for 15 plus years, and her experience goes very, very deep in the banking industry. So thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to have you, Alicia. For our audience, Alicia and I have known each other, but not worked together for about those 15 years through our local Association of Contingency Professionals organization, where we met and through a wide network of people that we're still in touch with today. So Alicia and I, when we first spoke, we had a conversation about possible topics, and what really came what rose to the top in terms of a passion of yours is the integration of business continuity in operational and enterprise risk management, or the lack thereof is probably more accurate. So we're going to focus on why this isn't and why it should be and how we can do this better. So Alicia, if you want to lead us off and tell us, why is this such a hot button for you?
Awesome. And thanks, Roswitha, for having me. And congratulations to you on the success of your podcast. And going into year 2, that's pretty awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, very awesome. So why it's a very much of a hot button topic for me is because, of course, again, as you referenced, I am in banking. Most of, if not all of my practitioner years have been in the banking industry. And in banking, we somewhat seem to have silos when it comes to how operational risk is managed under one pillar, and enterprise risk may be managed under a separate pillar, and business continuity in some instances sits in its own pillar, right? So everyone is operating in parallels instead of in integrations. When holistically, the risk that are being mitigated and monitored across each of the respective pillars overlap. The whys, right? The five W questions that we're really trying to solve for from a business continuity perspective, starting with that BC life cycle in the business continuity impact analysis. Really bleeds over into those other respective swim lanes, and to create a holistic story of integrated risk and what that looks like, what that risk posture looks like for your organization. It's very critical for us to start chiseling away at those silos where possible, and trying to bring all of those areas, operational areas, to the same table, if not under the same or similar umbrella organizational structure, again, so it can really tell the story, the risk framework of your organization.
Excellent point. Something that comes to mind immediately is the wasted effort
Yes.
in each of these silos, redoing work that somebody else may have already done, or you can build on rather than starting from scratch, with virtually every organization I know of operating lean in some way. It seems to me that this is a really inefficient way, not to mention risky way, of dealing with risk management. Tell me your
Completely
thoughts on
agree.
that.
I completely agree. Completely agree. And one of the components that you missed out on that's really key to just that holistically, Roswitha, are stakeholders.
Mhm,
The inefficiencies with our stakeholders,
mhm,
because of course the questions may be the same but different, if that makes sense.
mhm,
So how can we take those questions and summarize that question or summarize that survey in a
mhm,
manner to where our stakeholders who are also
mhm,
competing with resources, they're also, the whole do more with less concept and whatnot. How can we make those processes more efficient for them to where they can really understand how risks are being measured, right? How risks are being mitigated, not just in one pocket. For you, I'm sure you've heard this question over your time as a professional. What is business continuity? What do you all do? Why are you
mhm,
all there? I never use my plan. I'm not going to pick it up, when the rain starts falling,
mhm.
right? So those are common questions. I think a lot of that goes back to education with our stakeholders on the purpose of business continuity and the importance of it. But at the same time, I think it's an easier story to tell if we're starting with the respective pillars and showing exactly how that data from the operational risk side to the enterprise, well, the enterprise risk into the operational risk feed
Mhm.
into your business continuity plan. So
Absolutely.
I think it's a hard sell for many, right? Because I think holistically, Roswitha, if you look, enterprise risk for some is a new term.
Yeah.
And so many are really trying to still yet figure out, what does enterprise risk mean? How
Mhm,
do I integrate that into my organization? And starting there at that particular point, how do I introduce it to the various stakeholders? And from there, how do I, once I can tell an enterprise story, how do I start to integrate that
mhm.
into the other risk pillars that are critical to my organization?
So in our initial conversation, one of the things that came up was the fact that the one area that you see some integration typically is with disaster recovery, the IT side of things. My thoughts on that are that that just simply goes back to the fact that DR essentially predates business continuity as a concept, and that as companies became more and more dependent upon technical systems, that sort of happened by necessity. But since that sort of time period, which is now, business continuity has been around for decades now, and DR goes back, a decade or two before that. I think that we haven't, as practitioners, we haven't done as good of a job as we could have making ourselves heard at the various tables. Um, why do you think that is? And I'm not putting the blame solely on practitioners. There's a lot of corporate stuff that happens also, but just
Correct.
from our side of things, from the BC perspective, why do you think we haven't, as a profession, gotten sort of where we need to be in that collaboration?
Yeah, I think again, that kind of goes back to
Mhm,
the storytelling and working in the silos. In some organizations, you will absolutely see your business continuity and your disaster recovery teams operate under one
mhm,
umbrella. In many of them, you'll see DR is a part of IT.
mhm,
And of course, it's just that competing story. IT is really trying to figure out what is business continuity? Why do we need these plans? Right? Because there's that competition between a incident response plan
Mhm.
on the DR side versus a business continuity plan on the BC side? And how do
Right.
we tell that story of integration?
Mhm.
Right. And so, of course, again, those issues predate both you and I, right? Because, of course, that
Yeah.
has been, I think, really a story that when I first started business continuity, it was a story that we struggled to tell then.
Mhm.
Right. And although it's gotten better, I'm not going to absolutely say, right, we're still chiseling away at the Flintstone days of the past.
Mhm.
We are learning how to tell that story better. And in doing so, it's going to start with testing, right? How do we test our DR components and integrate those business lines?
Mhm.
Because of course, with that, that's where you're going to identify the risk. It's the recovery of the business line as they're working through their exercise scripts or whatnot,
Right.
to really identify what they can and cannot recover in their recovery time, their defined recovery time
Mhm.
objectives. That is the story of risk. But as you're aware, being aligned under IT doesn't necessarily, and I love those IT professionals that may be tapping into this. And if you want to further the conversation, reach out to Roswitha because I'm happy to let's do that, right? That's
Yeah.
how we make it better. Um, but from the IT perspective, they're really not looking at the risk.
Mhm.
They're just looking from the DR perspective, they're not looking at the risk.
Mhm.
How can we recover it more quickly? So, of course, in that manner, that's where we continue from a BC perspective to kind of get shoved down
Mhm.
in that framework, right? And DR is typically not one of those groups that will swim in enterprise risk or operational risk because theoretically your IT departments do not align with any of those organizations.
Right.
Although I'm starting to see a little bit more maturity and growth where IT risk is becoming its actual defined department. And although they may not sit under the enterprise risk framework in many
Mhm.
organizations, there is a connection point,
Yeah.
right, to be able to tell that story in a manner that really, to your point, a BC person, yeah, we may be at the table, and I mean this respectfully, but our voice may not be
Mhm.
as well received as
Yeah.
the IT risk individual that's there to tell the actual exposure um, of an IT component.
I think, like, looking back over clients and industries, so much can depend on the which department your business continuity reports up to and the level of commitment of your executive sponsor. You know, BC can sit in various parts of an organization. And while there's best practices in theory about where business continuity should sit, all of that sort of presupposes that you're going to have a sponsor that is deeply committed to the need for business continuity. And if that's not necessarily the case, sometimes there's just competing priorities. It's not anything against a particular sponsor necessarily or the department in which they reside. But you could be under IT, which is best practice is not necessarily ideal, but if you have a really strong voice, making sure that you're at the table with the C-suite, then that is much more valuable than being under the right department
Yes.
and not really having somebody who's trying to elevate the conversation and bring you into that. So we've talked about like sort of from the BC side of the things, what can we do? But from a sort of corporate perspective, the strength of the voice of the sponsor, I think, exceeds any other relevance in terms of where do you sit organizationally, because that person assuming that they are a C-suite member, which they should be, that voice, if it is strong and really committed to the success of business continuity, that can really bring you to the table in conversations about enterprise and organizational risk and resilience, more than being in the right department. If you don't have somebody who really gets it and who's really committed to it. So the goal is better risk mitigation all around. That's
that's huge.
That's the goal. So how do we get ourselves to where, having that voice for us, making sure that we are brought into conversations with operational risk and enterprise risk is really the key to success in this greater integration and collaboration. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here, summarizing for the audience kind of how and where this needs to fit.
But I love it though. I love it. I mean, because that's the education of it, right?
Right.
Many folks really don't understand and note that there are actual certifications, there are actual degree plans, there are actual things that will help drive that conversation more efficiently. Right. And I think it is to that point is if we've got the C-suite that has that knowledge, that has that experience and expertise, very high level in what that means and how that integration, how we can go from working in, different parallels to working in integration is huge. Because of course, really that system impact analyses, how beneficial is that to a business impact analyses? Mm-hmm. How many times, right? Because there is that codependency, right, on your RPOs, your RTCs, to your RTOs. And so how do we have to have collectively the right voice at the table to be able to drive the integration in a manner that will encompass holistically and tell the right story for your organizations and the risk.
Absolutely. You had mentioned RTOs or RPOs, and earlier you talked a little bit about BIAs. Something I think the data collection aspect of it that you had mentioned in our initial conversation, I think is really important for our audience to understand. And I think where we started from in our conversation had to do with, imagine if the data collection that we did for business continuity was comprehensive enough that we're all gathering and looking at the same information, and every aspect of risk takes what they need from it. But we're not doing multiple data collections, because that just drives everybody crazy and it's inefficient. And no wonder people don't like to see us coming when they've been asked similar questions by another department 3 months ago. I feel like that's an area where there's a lot of improvement, where enterprise risk, operational risk, business continuity, all of those areas need not all of this data necessarily or the same level of detail, but they all need similar data to make good decisions about risk mitigation and strategy. What would be how would you envision, if you were to look at this and say, this is ideally how I would structure this within an organization so that we're not going back to the trough for multiple versions of BIAs and this and that from different departments? What would be your sort of ideal picture of how that would work, and where, who gets which data and how does all that flow?
Oh, absolutely. I think that too can really start with the first step that I would take, Roswitha, would be assessing the tools, assessing the tools that are used within your organization, right? Because one of the other areas that we do have challenges in is that in many instances, risks are measured in various tools within an organization. That may go back to your vendor risk, that goes to your IT risk being leveraged or being mitigated in a different tool, your cyber risk, coming out of a different tool. So assessing all of those various tools that are being used and determine, based from a top-down approach, what tool actually can meet the strategic objectives of your organization. And if there is one vendor tool that can fit that model for you,
Mhm.
then from there, let's take all of the various parallels and
Mhm.
let's sit down and say, hey, based off of our firm's strategic direction, let's look at your primary risk.
Mhm.
What is it that you use these tools to capture? And when you're going to those stakeholders, what are you asking?
Mhm.
What are the questions that keep you up at night? Then again, this is all collectively working together to come up with a model, a bank of questions that sit under every risk pillar for your
Mhm.
organization, and drive that in to training for your stakeholders,
Mhm.
right? So that they can understand why you're collecting the data. And then, of course, system or data entry into one blanket tool that's going to tell that entire story for your organization. So when the incident occurs, right, I kind of see it as crisis management, right?
Mhm.
Because under your crisis umbrella, these are all the same people, same or similar folks that will be right at
Mhm.
your crisis table. They're a part of your crisis team. And so you'll be going to those individuals to say, hey, this is the situation, right? This is
Mhm.
our assessment. How does this impact you? Right. And so from there, you have to go into your source tool and pull the data, so on and so forth. Now, from that, right, the crises is managed under the same one tool. The data is populated so everybody is telling the same story. So your stakeholders can really see how the business continuity collection and analysis of that data, either it drove their tier rating, right?
Mhm.
And their recovery priority, how we reached Z, and
Yeah.
why business continuity is so important.
Right.
Um, so a very long way to say, really, but it's assessing the various levels, right?
Mhm.
Starting with the tools. What questions are you asking our stakeholders? How can we formalize that approach on our questionnaire or our survey
Mhm.
to our stakeholders? Train our stakeholders to what that looks like. Put all of that data into one consistent tool that can tell the story
Mhm.
of enterprise, operational, and BCDR risk, right?
Risk.
All at the same time.
Same time.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Wouldn't that save so much time and money?
Oh my gosh. I
I
just
know.
feel like it's like, okay, Alicia, are you not praying for the right thing at night? Because that just sounds like, hopefully somebody is listening that says, hey, we have that tool. Hey, our operating model at our organization is just that, right? And maybe it's someone that can come to the table and absolutely tell us, how did they get that top down buy-in? How
Mhm.
do they have the right voice in that C-suite that really understands the
Yeah.
various segments, that understands business continuity risk and
Mhm.
what that means to your organization? And how are you all telling that story, right? Because there's various, sometimes you feel, what's the purpose of our business continuity committee, right? Because they're sitting on the BC committee, they're sitting on an IT risk committee, they're sitting on an operational committee, right? There's the various risk related committees, but we're all telling different stories instead of holistically telling the right story for your brand, so you can know how to better prioritize
Nice.
the resolution. Yeah,
That, you know, and certainly business continuity has come a very long way.
it has. I
Absolutely
am
no
so
doubt.
proud when you think about what you've done, and when I think about what I've done. I don't want to speak for you, but when I think about what I've done in that time as a practitioner, I just have to pat myself on the back every single day, because it's the one thing that I love about BC, is that I've learned so much. I've grown so much. And as the word risk has kind of come on the market, right? Because remember, Roswitha, risk, did we really talk about, did we use that term as much? When you first
Not in
started as
the
a
early
professional.
days. Not in the early days. The conversation was different for sure. And as our field has matured, yes, I definitely see where everything is headed towards a more integrated, more holistic version of what we do. Instead of talking about business continuity, we're talking about enterprise resilience. And although
Mm,
there's a whole separate conversation and even a podcast about this terminology and how meaningful it is or is not, certainly it does speak to our field's sort of more comprehensive vision of what can be achieved. Something that I want to dive briefly into something that you had mentioned that I'm very fond of. Different terminology for it, but all hazards approach to planning. Tell me why that is so connected to this conversation about risk management.
oh,
I
absolutely.
mean, I know the answer. I know the answer to this, but I want you to walk us through this for our audience, because we've got all levels of people listening.
Oh, that's awesome. So then another conversation that you and I need to have on the end is, what's your term? If it's not all hazards, what's your term? See, because
Okay,
that's
sure.
the openness for me, is that,
Mhm.
hey, listen, just because you use one term, referring back to that other podcast, there are other
Yeah.
terms that may fit your organization,
Mhm.
or has been adopted by your organization to fit their model better. But the all hazards approach, and how the importance of that when it comes to mitigating risk. Because, of course, adverse weather, you live here in Texas with me, and adverse weather is something that we can face on a daily basis. Right? The thunderstorm can result in a massive windstorm, right? As
Mhm.
what we saw last night.
Mhm.
That can result in the power outages, that can result in the right, this, that, and the third. Each of those risks, uh, depending on how you score them or measure them within your enterprise, when you're looking at your scoring, can be different.
Mhm.
Right? So, as you're going through your different strategy planning sessions with your respective stakeholders and with your leaders from a crisis perspective, you really have to understand what the risk of each of the respective hazards
Mhm.
is to your framework, so that,
Mhm.
of course, you can ensure that you're planning for those hazards in a manner that is sustainable to your vendors, to your
Mhm.
clients, right? To every single one, up to your regulatory agencies, to every
Mhm.
single one of your touch points.
Mhm.
And so, of course, again, I understand that the vendor risk story may be slightly different,
Mhm.
right? Because from a vendor perspective, your risk may be just those top 5 vendors that it takes to keep your doors open,
Mhm.
right? Or that's,
Mhm.
if you've outsourced everything, then you only really care about those top 5 vendors.
Right.
But from a client perspective and from a people and property perspective,
Mhm.
I need my building. So that risk might be a little bit higher to me because, of course, my network gear may be in that building,
Mhm.
right? There's just so many different avenues to what that looks like.
Mhm.
So, all hazards planning perspective and what that does and what that means to mitigating risk, it really helps you tell the story for your institution. If I live in Texas and I'm only planning for a tornado, or if I'm only planning for an earthquake or hurricane, sorry, or we have earthquakes in Texas. If I'm only silo planning, then of course there are other risks that are not being mitigated appropriately for my firm.
Mhm.
From a business continuity planning perspective, we should absolutely be looking at an all hazards based approach, because business is changing so rapidly around
Mhm.
us. And in order to encompass every absolute hazard that could rightfully impact your organization, its people, its property, your vendors, your clients, etc., you really need to look at the holistic all hazards approach to planning, and how you can leverage that to mitigate the risk of your org.
Absolutely. All right. I think we're about out of time, so we're going to wrap this up for today. From my perspective of listening to you share your thoughts on this, I come back to, for me, it's all about the efficiency. I think if the silos that you described can be bridged in such a way that we're operating with similar language, priorities, processes, data gathering, so much more could be accomplished with the resources that any organization has. They're limited in some way. What's kind of your thought on what's the single most important thing that can be done to kind of further this integration and collaboration between these risk silos?
Certainly, great question. What I feel can happen is the conversation, right? Communication is where we fail, right? Even as professionals, it starts with the communication. Getting the appropriate stakeholders in each of those respective swim lanes, in your enterprise risk bucket, in your operational risk bucket. You referenced DR. I don't want to throw those partners out because they are equally as important and deserve a seat at our table, and our BC partners. Let's have the collective conversation on what keeps you up at night, understanding what those risks are, understanding how those risks align with the strategic direction or the strategic output of your organization, and developing that framework collectively, right? Instead of in the silos that we see today.
I could not agree more. Alicia, thank you so much for joining me today. I really have enjoyed our conversation. I've enjoyed reconnecting with you. And now that we get to keep in touch more often. Thank you to Kingsbridge for sponsoring our podcast. Look for the Kingsbridge BCP podcast wherever you find your podcasts. We're available on YouTube, everywhere else, video or audio only. And thanks again. And we drop a new one every 2 weeks. Thanks, Alicia. I'd love to have you back for another conversation on another topic.
Thanks, Roswitha.
Appreciate it.